Trump held his first campaign rally in Tulsa. What did you take away from that event?
Well, I want to be as balanced as possible, Larry. Thank you for having me on. I would say the event was underwhelming from an attendance perspective, but I think they got a lot of rich data out of all of that registration that went on. But I think he, knowing his personality reasonably well, I think he was very disappointed on Saturday night.
How much trouble is he in? You have your fingertips on everything. Is he in big trouble?
I do think he's in big trouble. I think that the momentum is swinging very hard against him right now. But this is a very good prize fighter. And so, if it's a boxing metaphor, he has to be knocked out of the ring. A knockdown, a TKO. You're not going to win this on a decision. You have to send him right through the ropes. So one of the good things that happened to him the other night, he did so poorly that it could create some complacency on the other side. And so if they want to beat him, they've got to come at him 3 times harder now.
I know him for 40 years. I know you know him. He seems to have no empathy. In other words, he's talking about the statues, let's say, of the Confederacy. And instead of saying, I understand how black Americans could feel, he just rips them apart and says, don't tear them down, their great American heritage. What do you make of that?
Well, I think the problem is, as I said this in the paper, he's the modern LBJ, and so his skill set is hitting an era of time where all of the things that he was good at that got him to where he is not helping him for where he is right now. And so that's the problem. He doesn't have that empathy skill set. He doesn't have that emotional EQ. And so he's right now pitting a culture war. He's got the red Republican tribe against the blue Democratic tribe, and he's saying, hold on to the heritage. This is like our guns. This is like our prayer books. He's trying to create that dynamic rather than trying to unify the country. I think that's a mistake.
The civil war in Syria has raged on since 2011. The U.S. intervened in 2014 and since then has held the position that elected leader Bashar al-Assad must be removed from power. But is the U.S. changing its stance? Recently, U.S. envoy to Syria James Jeffrey indicated a policy shift when he said, quote, we are not saying Assad has to go. Despite Jeffrey's remarks, experts say it is still too early to determine whether the position of the U.S. has changed. This week on the News with Rick Sanchez, Rick was joined by former UK MP George Galloway and former Pentagon official Michael Maloof to weigh in on what this potential shift could mean for Syria.
The fact that he's coming out and saying that Assad doesn't necessarily have to go anymore and that we're not necessarily looking for regime change, to me that does have to have some kind of impact, no?
Yes, it's good of them to say so, but as Michael says, that's because they couldn't remove Bashar al-Assad, and 500,000 people had to leave their blood on the ground, in the sand, in the vain effort to remove him. It's an inglorious period. Don't beat yourselves up alone, because Britain every bit as culpable in this 500,000 dead people. What a mountain that is. And of course, using our proxies in the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, all these people were involved in trying to destroy the secular Arab Republic of Syria, even if it meant putting in power the people that brought down the Twin Towers and killed thousands of Americans less than 20 years ago. Inglorious. We were the Air Force, we were the missile force of Al-Qaeda, and something even worse than Al-Qaeda, namely the ISIS excretion which crept across the region and then across the rest of the world. So it's not a chapter in history that we'll be able to look back on with any pride at all. And it's been an utter miserable failure as well as an immoral mess.
Michael, let me put you on the hot spot on this story. Most Americans watching us right now have no earthly clue what's really going on in that country. They just know there's a bunch of factions fighting, and sometimes we're on one side, the Russians are on another side, and the Turks have now gotten in there. It's just too hard to keep score. In the end, would you recommend that we as a nation should just step aside in that conflict?
Well, first of all, we were never invited in as the Russians and the Iranians were by the government there. That's a legitimate government, Assad's government. Whether we like Assad or not, he was voted in. He's recognized by the United Nations as the leader. We were never invited in. We are occupying the Northeast.
Amid protests across the country calling for reforms to address police brutality and systemic racism, several current and former members of the U.S. military have been arrested, with authorities saying they all identify with far-right extremist groups. This week on The World According to Jesse, host Jesse Ventura and producer Brigitte Santos break down the terrorism charges facing some of those who were arrested. Jesse also weighs in as a military veteran, calling their alleged actions complete treason.
And active duty Army reservist Andrew Linham, Air Force veteran William Loomis, and Navy vet Stephen Parshall have been arrested on terrorism charges for allegedly conspiring to incite violence during the George Floyd protests in Las Vegas. The men are accused of making Molotov cocktails before heading to the protests, but they also allegedly discussed firebombing a Forest Service station and an energy station in Nevada previously. Authorities say these men self-identify as members of the Boogaloo movement. Jesse, you're a veteran. How does it make you feel to see these current and former service members carrying out or planning attacks of violence here at home? Is this just a symptom of our war culture?
Well, it may be a symptom. It could be a symptom of the war culture. Basically, what it is complete treason. You know, obviously, every person that enters the military takes an oath to protect the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Well, when you wage war against your own country like they're doing, that's obviously a war against the Constitution, too, of the United States of America. These guys are traitors. I think the military needs to start screening better some of the people they're bringing in. But again, that's difficult because we're an all volunteer service today, and less than 1%, I think it's 0.05 or something, 0.5%, actually serve in the military in some capacity. So it's not a popular place to go get a job because the American people generally don't go there. It's a difficult situation. They need bodies, and whenever you need bodies, you got to lower standards to get those bodies.
President Donald Trump hasn't said anything about labeling members of the Boogaloo movement as terrorists, but he has said that he wants to declare people who identify with the leftist anti-fascist movement known as Antifa as terrorists. And so far, no anti-fascists have yet been charged with crimes by authorities, but as you've seen here, at least 4 Boogaloo boys have. So why is there a difference here?
Well, because the Boogaloo boys are extremely right-wing, which Trump is very right-wing. I'm surprised he doesn't come out and call them freedom fighters. You know, that might be a terminology we're going to wait to hear. But obviously, it's the difference between the right and the left. Trump will blame the far left for everything that goes wrong, and he remains noticeably silent on the far right when he made the statement there were good people on both sides, including the white supremacist side, which I've never met a good white supremacist in my lifetime.
We'll be back with more of Just Press Play right after this.
I like it when the...
We are first to bring you this story. This edition of
There are stories you need to know.
After confidence will be the last leg of the yield from the 210.
Welcome back. I'm Jonathan Harris, and you're watching Just Press Play, the show that brings you in-depth reports, exclusive interviews, and controversial issues you may have missed during the week on RT America. The International Trade Union Confederation has ranked the United States as the worst country for workers' rights among the 7 largest economies in the world. This week on America's Lawyer, host Mike Papantonio was joined by producer Brigitte Santos to break down exactly why the U.S. ranked so poorly.
Now, the ratings go from best to worst on a scale of 1 to 5, depending on compliance with collective labor rights. The U.S. has been given a rating of 4, which means that the government and companies engage in serious efforts to crush the collective voice of workers and put fundamental rights under threat. America is the only group of 7 nation with systemic violations of rights in the workplace. Other countries around the globe that also bear 4 ratings include Mexico, Nigeria, Congo, and Venezuela, all of which have fewer resources than the United States.
What kinds of violations, Brigitte, are the most common against employees right now? What do you see as the trend?
What the Global Rights Index has exposed is a breakdown in the social contract that governments and employers have with workers. Now, this isn't only happening in the United States, but on a global scale. And in fact, violations against workers around the world have reached a 7-year high, with upward trends in restricting collective bargaining, criminalizing striking, and excluding workers from joining or establishing unions. While it's not illegal to strike or establish unions in America, workers who try to do so here are often retaliated against by employers. You know, back in 2017, a judge had ruled that Tesla CEO Elon Musk broke the law by threatening employees and retaliating against them for wanting to unionize. Another U.S.-based company that does things like this is Amazon. You know, they've been accused time and time again of firing workers who have led or participated in strikes.
You know, one story that we did a while back I thought was really interesting is that they were actually doing plants. They're putting plants inside around workers to act as spies to figure out whether unions are developing, to find out who has a complaint. It's really an ugly process. But the point to me that's important here is as we beat down unions in the United States, the American middle class is disappearing. They're not around anymore. And what that ends up doing is moving to the 0.0001% of the economy of Americans holding on to all the money. It's a really ugly story. When this federation says, look, we looked at everything and this is bad. I want to ask you this. How has the coronavirus pandemic allowed companies to even advance this further on worker agendas?
Well, since the COVID-19 outbreak, many companies have changed the rules to boost their own financial interests at the expense of workers.
This week, nearly 1.5 million workers filed for unemployment insurance. This is the 14th straight week more than 1 million people have filed jobless claims. There are currently more than 19 million Americans receiving unemployment. This all comes as the International Monetary Fund says the global economy will take a $12 trillion hit from the coronavirus pandemic. The IMF is also now projecting a longer recovery than initially forecast. This week on Boombust, host Brent Jabbour was joined by former Fed insider Danielle DiMartino Booth and economics professor Richard Wolff to analyze the state of the economy.
What do you make of this latest global forecast from the IMF? Is this what you are seeing in the world's economy, or do you think it might be much worse? And what are you looking at when it comes to recovery?
No, I think my hat goes off to the IMF for being able and willing to correct their own, now we can see rosy projections, and to take into account how serious this is. I'm in the position of having to tell my colleagues here in the United States that this is the worst collapse of capitalism since the Great Depression of the 1930s. We don't know how deep it'll cut. We don't know how long it'll last. But one thing we know for sure is that it is already the most severe contraction. And if history is any guide, the ramifications of that will last and hurt us for years to come.
And now, Danielle, the IMF's chief economist also spoke about the role of central banks in fighting this economic crisis as well. We have
substantial monetary and fiscal support will need to be continued, but appropriate safeguards should be put in place. There should be proper fiscal accounting, fiscal transparency, and when it comes to monetary policy, central bank independence has to be maintained.
And with the IMF advocating for central bank intervention, Danielle, is this going to be the new normal for the foreseeable future?
You know, I can't see a different path forward. That the Federal Reserve, for one, has had such an impossible time trying to extricate itself from its very large balance sheet. Its attempt at quantitative tightening failed, and the Fed was the chief central bank on planet Earth that was able to normalize the most for as little as it accomplished headed into this next crisis. We saw that the European Union went into recession with interest rates already in the negative. The same goes with Japan. So I think, to the IMF's point, it's going to be very difficult for central banks to step back from where they are, given the projections for how long this downturn is expected to be. We're not expected to get jobs back for years and years to come. So I think that the central banks will become a permanent fixture of sorts.
And now we're hearing a lot of bubble talk these days. Earlier this week, we talked about Jeremy Grantham, the investor who called the last 3 financial bubbles, saying that this bubble is the real McCoy as far as bubbles go. And Ed Yardeni of Yardeni Research is saying that if the Fed continues to flood markets with liquidity, it could risk the greatest financial bubble of all time.
For a broader look at the economy, I'm joined by Boombust host Brent Jabbour. Brent, thank you for joining me. Of
course.
So when we talked about this last time, it was toward the beginning of the pandemic, and you were telling me that we wouldn't really know for sure how things were going to look. There was a recession projected, all of that, until the reopening started. We've begun the reopening. How are things looking?
Well, we're not really getting the economic data yet. Obviously, we'll have to wait at least until the end of June, which probably into July, before we'll actually see where Q2 ended up, where the actual month of June ended up, and really where May is following up. But what you are seeing is, because of this spike in new cases, we are seeing that reopening efforts are slowing down now and actually stopping, which is going to put another strain on the economy. So that's
Texas, right? Where they
Texas, Arizona. We're seeing Florida. Now, obviously, not everybody's making a political decision to return to those stay-at-home orders, but if they do, eventually you're going to see that. And you're also seeing stores like the Apple Store saying they're going to close all the stores that they reopened in certain places. So that's just obviously a small piece of the economy, but when you see a big company like that make that decision, you're also going to be looking at small local businesses making those same decisions. So it's still a little too early to tell what that economic impact of reopening is, but soon we will see that.
Okay, so we're still waiting a little bit. We still have a little bit of a wait to see what's coming next.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we found out that, like I was saying earlier, that almost 1.5 million people filed for unemployment. 14th straight week, over 1 million people were filing. NASDAQ, you were telling me earlier when we were preparing for the segment, has seen record highs since the pandemic. Is there a disconnect between Wall Street? It seems like there's a huge disconnect between Wall Street and Main Street with how the pandemic is affecting everyone.
Absolutely. And you're going to see, so you'll always see news reports every single day. It's the Dow raised on this news, the Dow dropped on this news. But that really has nothing to do with it, because what we're actually seeing is most markets are actually controlled by speculation. So they're looking at what might be the case. And obviously, if you're a trader, right, and markets have been very volatile recently, they kind of dipped a little bit. You want to buy low, and you might have to sit there and wait. So you might see those spikes on no news, but that's because people were buying low. The sell-offs are because things are a lot higher than normal. Now, obviously, we're seeing NASDAQ record highs. That is a little bit more based in economic data, because what you're seeing is NASDAQ is a tech-heavy stock index. So you have your Microsofts, your Netflix, your Facebook, your Amazon. All of them live on the NASDAQ. So, of course, they're bound to see record highs because people are stuck at home. They're using all of these products, all of this technology. So we are seeing that. Another thing to keep in mind is a lot of traders look at this, and our friend Tobin Smith, who regularly appears on Boombust and other shows on the network, he actually says, look, they're pricing out 2021 right now. That's what they're buying. They're not really buying a recovery of the COVID pandemic.
So they're not even really, essentially, they're not even in this year with us. They're ahead of us.
Yeah.
And that's okay.
Where a retail trader like yourself or myself, we're going to buy on the news, make small trades here and there. But the people who are spending millions and millions of dollars, they're looking so far ahead. They're way ahead of us.
Okay. So we have the stock market doing better than the average American seems to be doing with this. In the beginning, it hit record lows not seen since the collapse of 1987. Right? Do you forecast that will be happening anytime soon? If we're seeing the record highs, if we keep seeing states slowing their reopening processes, more spikes in cases. Do you think that we'll see another dramatic drop, or do you think that it hit bottom already?
Testing those lows is going to be very, very tough, but we're seeing it this week. After having a couple of weeks of positive gains on all three major indices here in the U.S., you're seeing at the end of the week, markets are dropping, and a lot of that is coming on this economic data. A lot of it also has to do with a little bit of inside baseball when it comes to banking regulation. Banks actually kind of popped it late in the week after the Volcker rule. Some of those restrictions were actually pulled back, and then they actually went down a little bit as stock buybacks were restricted by the Federal Reserve. So you do have a little bit of news, things that are pushing markets up and down there. But you have to remember, in March, we saw several times where markets actually had to stop trading because they dropped so much. We haven't seen that since March. Now, we have seen some close to 1,000-point drops here and there, and volatility is up a little bit. It's at about a 30, where it had been at about a 20 for the last couple of weeks. But you have to remember, in March, it was at about 70. So you do have a lot of those things to look at. I don't have a crystal ball, so it's very hard for me to tell you tomorrow, here's what we're going to see. And everybody who we have on as an analyst, they're right sometimes, they're wrong sometimes. It's just kind of the way it works in this business.
Sounds like the roller coaster is going to continue. Boombust host Brent Jabbour, thank you so much for joining me. That's it for Just Press Play. I'm Jonathan Harris. To see more of the clips you just saw here, download the Portable.tv app for your Apple or Android device. We'll see you here next week, and as always, don't forget to question more.